So how do you use something without wearing it out or ruining it? That's a question posed to me by you guys and anyone that's seen my car in person. They always comment on how immaculate it is. Well, the short answer about the hi-hat in the background there is this. The answer to that is I've only had it for a few months, and the people that I purchased it off, the importers who bought it and got it registered in compliance in Australia, custom Ketsa conversions in New South Wales, did a fantastic job on refreshing the car. So that gave me a really good base. But when people do say how clean my car is, or people mention how nice it is, they're not talking about how clean I keep it. It's that it's unblemished, unlike my own personal life. Both inside and out, I'm just dead to the core. This isn't the only car that I've ever had, and it's not the only car that's been in this shape. I tend to do the same things that I do to this thing with every other car that I've ever had, and keep them in the same sort of condition. So I thought I'd share what I do to my cars in the hopes that it helps you. So obviously there's a few basic things that is basically common sense. Things like not sliding off the seat, wearing rings, and then using the steering wheel or the gear shift lever, which can wear things out, but that's pretty much common sense. And also little things like not scraping your arm along one spot on the door consistently and constantly, which will wear the door card away. So today we're just focusing on the mechanical aspects of things and the cleaning and detailing. So there is a big difference in looking after something old versus new. A new car will always have that service logbook with it that stipulates what should be replaced at certain intervals. Chances are, if you have an old car like mine, that service logbook is long gone. So the difference between having a new car versus an old car is, and I'm using mine as an example, you need to have much more of a vested interest in how the work, specifically mechanical work, gets done on your car. For example, every single workshop that I've worked in and every single workshop that I know of does coolant flushes a certain way, and that is, even if the logbook stipulates to do a coolant flush, the mechanics or the technicians will undo the drain plug on the radiator. The radiator will then drain empty, and then they redo that drain plug and fill up the radiator with fresh antifreeze. The trouble there is there's still a whole bunch of old coolant still sitting in the hoses, in the engine, the cylinder head, the heater core, and the hi-hat, for example, has 2 heater cores and a whole lot of pipe work and ducting. So you want to do it properly, you want to make sure that it gets flushed out properly so you don't have old stuff sitting in there. In my last video I mentioned that certain cars in Japan sometimes don't get coolant changes for about 10 years. That's a long time, so you do want to make sure you're doing it properly if you are going to be doing it. The second part of that is if you're getting an automatic transmission flush. There are 2 ways of doing that as well. I once took my car into a dealership and specifically asked them to do the automatic transmission filter. After 4 days of waiting, I went to pick up the car and I asked them how dirty the old filter was, because I had just bought the car. And turns out they didn't do the filter. They just plumbed up the actual flush machine to it. So what they do is they take a machine that plugs into the automatic transmission cooler, and it basically circulates a lot of new fluid with the old fluid, pumps the old stuff out and puts some new stuff in. The trouble there is you don't know what's caught in the filter, and that filter, especially in a high mileage old car, could be quite deteriorated. It could be the difference between having a transmission rebuild in 2 years versus another 20 years. Regardless if you do work yourself or you find a mechanic to do it, make sure that you have that level of communication so that whoever works on your car knows how you like to have things done on your car, and make sure that it gets done properly. I would recommend dealing with a smaller workshop where you can deal one-on-one with the person that actually owns the company or will be working on your car, or both, as opposed to just a guy in a suit who's there to upsell you on, I don't know, a coolant flush, which they won't do properly. Also, even if your car was sold new in your country and it's not an import like mine, it's important to know that dealerships often don't know the best way to take care of that car, especially as it gets older and new models come in. Technicians retire, and that level of knowledge doesn't really get passed down, especially when it comes to older cars. So case in point, I had a Land Cruiser 105 series and I took it into a dealership when I was too busy to get a service. That's also when it took 4 days just to get a service when I was promised 1. But besides, you know, the bad service that you receive, well, I received personally, that's just my experience, I could smell burning for about 2 days straight, and it was a really hot summer, and I never smelled that kind of burning before. I didn't know exactly where it was coming from. I knew it was coming from around the car, and that the engine was making a lot of ticking noises. Eventually the oil pressure dropped on the gauge, and I stopped and pulled the dipstick, and it was bone dry. It's at that point I immediately knew what they had done. I went back, I checked the invoice that they gave me, and sure enough they put 0W20 oil inside, which is not the right oil for that engine. It was designed to run on 10W40 or 15W50 as new, and so it just burnt it away. But they very kindly offered me a $20 fuel voucher, and even more generously they offered to quote me for engine damage free of charge. Not fix it, but quote me. Another example in keeping with that, just to show you that dealerships don't necessarily understand the cars that you might have, especially older cars, is I had another Land Cruiser with Burfield joints, hubs, live axle front on it, and I drove it across the country, and when I got to the other side of the country, the front hubs were looking a little bit dry. So not having any tools with me, not having a grease gun on me, I took it into a dealership and I asked if they could pack some grease or pump some grease into the front hubs. And the service advisor looked really confused. The service advisor is a guy in the nice crisp white shirt that's trying to sell you wiper blades, if you don't know. And he called the foreman or the service manager. And the service manager didn't know, and he called a technician. And there's a certain time where you realize the people that you're speaking with in certain businesses don't know what they're talking about. It's approximately the same time that they will make a definitive decision whilst not knowing what they're talking about, and then try and convince you of it. So in this case, the service manager and the technician told me that the Burfield joints are sealed units and they're not serviceable. In order to get more grease in there, you have to rebuild both the front hubs. So I didn't do that. I went to the automotive shop, I bought some grease and a 14mm spanner. I undid the service nut and I packed them full of grease. More recently, a lot of the information and knowledge that I've gathered on how to do things has been by force really, because I knew that I would be the only one that would be able to do it properly. And so if you want to do a quality job, a lot of the times if you don't have a trustworthy mechanic that also knows what they're doing, you're going to have to unfortunately learn how to do it yourself. But luckily for you and me, there's a wealth of information and knowledge on the internet. Speaking of doing a quality job, there is not enough that can be said for using quality fluids and filters. Little serviceable components like that can have a dramatic effect on the lifespan of your car. I'm a big believer in full synthetic fluids because they tend to last a long time, much longer than mineral. If I was just running mineral engine oil in my car, for example, I would be very inclined and stressed about it after about 3,000 kilometers. I would really look forward to replacing it. Whereas with running full synthetic engine oil, I'm happy to let it go up to 15,000 kilometers. And I know that's going to make a lot of people jump out of their seats, because some people, regardless of the oil or what they do, are just obsessed with changing their oil every 5,000 kilometers. I use good quality, the best, the top shelf, full synthetic diesel engine oil, and I replace my engine oil once a year or every 15,000 kilometers. And I guess the only aspect that's more important than the engine oil is the filter itself. So recently there's been a lot of issues with counterfeit oil filters. You might save yourself quite a significant amount by buying those counterfeit oil filters online, especially on eBay and places like that. I'm not saying every seller is dishonest. A lot of the times they don't even know themselves. Well, you might be thinking that you're saving yourself a couple of dollars and the branding and the packaging is right, but a lot of these oil filters have blocked up and that stopped the oil flow into the engine and actually cost the owners the entire engine. So for the sake of saving $15 versus your entire engine, it's just not worth it. So I know I've spoken a lot already. I tend to talk a lot because I have a lot to share, but essentially there are two things that I do to keep all of my cars that I've ever had in the same tip-top condition, and that is two schedules. The first one being maintenance and mechanical, and the second one being cleaning and detailing. You would know that when I buy a car, if you've seen the first video, the highest video, I like to do a complete mechanical reset. Most of the time I'm always buying used cars This is probably one of the lowest kilometer vehicles that I've ever bought, and it's probably one of the nicest cars that I've ever bought. Usually my cars have done a lot of kilometers because I just can't afford newer cars, like a lot of us. And I guess to my benefit, these things are getting a lot cooler nowadays. They're not just the old ruggedy cars anymore. So when I buy a car, I like to do a big heavy maintenance call. And I kind of treat my cars like airlines treat their planes, by sticking to a strict schedule and making sure that everything is covered. Remember I said that logbook servicing doesn't really cover everything to keep a car in good shape? And again, a lot of people is going to flinch at that because they say, well, if you stick to the logbook, that's what the manufacturer recommends. Yeah, but hey, you also have to realize that manufacturers know people don't want to buy and hold on to their cars forever. People buy their cars, and the usual ownership span is between 4 to 7 years, I think. And if a car makes it to 10 years, then the manufacturer has really outdone themselves. So in order to keep the cost down for the owner, and also to increase the profitability and service times for the dealership, what they do is they put in essentially just above the bare minimum requirements for mechanical maintenance. I mean, let me ask you this. When was the last time you ever saw any owner's manual throughout history, at least in the last 20-30 years, that specified power steering fluid changes? Never. I've yet to see a single manufacturer specify a power steering fluid system flush. And just imagine the amount of power steering racks and pumps that can be saved with just changing the fluid there, but no one seems to do that. I guarantee you that when I bought this Hi-Ace, it probably had the factory 23-year-old power steering fluid in there. So little things like that. So what I do when I buy a car is give it my 5-year heavy maintenance call, and it's obviously something that I do every 5 years. That includes things like the timing belt, the water pump, I do the thermostat, and a few other things as well, but it's essentially everything in one hit. A lot of people like to spread it out, maybe do the transmission oil every 2 years or 3 years, the diff oils every 2 or 3 years, and then do the timing belt every 7 years, things like that. For me, I do everything at once, and then every year after that, it's basic servicing, basic maintenance. So I actually got an email from Mark, hey Mark, about what needs to be replaced at what points in time. So everyone's service schedule should be a little bit different based on how you drive your car. When I was into my heavy off-roading and long distance touring and stuff, I would do my diff oils and transmission fluid much more frequently, especially if my diffs could be underwater. But for the Hi-Ace now, I'm just going to stick with my 5-year plan, which includes the timing belt, the fan belt. If you're going to do the timing belt, which comes in a kit usually with a water pump, you'd be silly not to do the thermostat at the same time. So I do the thermostat as well as things like the wheel bearings. Why wait until they seize up? Why wait until they get hot? Because chances are it's going to do it when you plan on doing that great road trip and your car that you've been savoring and planning for so long, and then all of a sudden you put all the weight in it to do that big trip, and that's when the wheel bearings will fail. And that's absolutely the wrong time to consider getting them done. Every 5 years, at least take them out and repack them with grease. 5 years is also how long my tires last. So when I do the big heavy maintenance, I know that's the time for new tires, and things like wiper blades and whatnot. If my wipers need to be replaced in between, I'll do it obviously. If not, every 5 years is the maximum I'll let them go before replacing them. Obviously in the 5-year service, I'll do the brake fluid, the power steering fluid, the front diff oil, rear diff oil, transfer case fluid, and the automatic transmission fluid, and the filter. Now necessarily you don't always have to do the filter, and a lot of mechanics will tell you that because they don't really like doing the transmission filter unless it's an automatic transmission shop. They'll tell you to just use that pump that pumps old fluid with new fluid, and that's actually not too bad, provided you have some history on the car and you know when the filter was last changed. You don't want to go about 10 years or more without having the automatic transmission filter replaced. So if, like my car, I've already had it done now, I won't bother with replacing the automatic transmission filter again at the next 5-year heavy maintenance call, unless I do some really heavy towing, or I drive the car in really harsh environments, like soft sand for example, where the gearbox is working really hard. Another question that's posed about the 1KZ, the 1HZ, the 1HDT engines is glow plugs there's a lot of talk about having to replace them every 100,000 kilometers. So I would actually do that every 5 years as well, replacing the glow plugs. There's also talk about replacing the injectors every 5 years. I don't do that. I've never actually replaced injectors on any of my cars, and that is because I use a fuel system conditioner in every fill up, and the one that I use treats up to 1,000 liters of diesel, so it will last you certainly a long time, and it conditions and cleans the entire fuel system. So while that might not make your injectors last forever, it should prolong its lifespan at least, but mostly it should prevent any sudden failures or clogging of your fuel injection system. And I'm not saying replacing injectors is a bad thing. I'm saying it might be unnecessary to do it every 5 years or every 100,000 kilometers. And you know, I would be foolish to think that my car runs just as it was when it was brand new, on brand new injectors today. At 23 years old, they are the original injectors on the car, because as owners we drive them every day. We might experience incremental losses in power that we don't really notice until we replace components like that. So if I notice that the car's starting to blow smoke, if I notice that it's sluggish, or if it's surging in power or losing power at certain RPMs, then yeah, definitely injectors are something that I'll look at. But that falls under repairs for me, which is outside of my standard maintenance regime. Quickly, just touching base on that 5-year heavy maintenance call, there are 2 types of timing belt kits, and you will need to discuss it with your mechanic or whoever does the timing belt as to which one you get. So you can either just get a belt. Actually, there's more than 2 types. You can either just get a belt, which your mechanic might just charge you a couple of hundred to replace, and it only takes about 20 to 30 minutes. You can get a belt and a water pump, which will take longer, or you can get the full kit, which is what I recommend. And the full kit has a belt, the water pump, and oil seals. So it's the actual round oil seals that go into the crankshaft and the camshaft position. And it's something that I highly recommend doing, because if you're already in there and it's every 5 years and you're replacing the timing belt, the water pump, the fan belts at the same time, it makes a lot of sense. Just replace the seals, because you don't want to have to do all of that work and not replace the seals, only to have it start leaking a year or 2 down the line. You know, and you have to go all the way back in there and then redo the whole thing. So it might cost you an extra $100 in labor to get that, and maybe an extra $30 in parts costs, but it's well worth it. Just do it. So that is pretty much everything that I do every 5 years to every car that I've ever had. If it didn't have a timing belt, all the better for me, I save money. But by doing that every 5 years, you essentially set yourself up for a really smooth and reliable 5 years after that. Every year after the 5-year service, engine oil, air filter and fuel filter, and obviously the engine oil filter. As part of every service, you should be checking the diff oils, the transfer case oil, the automatic transmission fluid, or even the manual transmission fluid if you have it, checking the brake fluid, checking the power steering fluid. Some people like to replace their brake fluid every 2 or 3 years. For me, I've found that that's been quite a recent development, with automotive workshops really promoting that brake fluid swap. And again, if you use a car in harsh, heavy environments, if there's a chance it's been contaminated, or if you live in a humid environment where maybe water has condensated inside the reservoir, yeah, definitely replace it. But for me, I replace it every 5 years, but I check it every single service. Checking the belts, even though they're fairly new, and belts should last about 7 years, 7 to 10 years, and considering I replace mine every 5 years, I know that chances are they're going to be in pretty good shape. The other things to do is to rotate your tires. So I get about 5 years out of my tires, and that's by rotating them, making sure they're inflated to the right pressures, and that goes for the spare tire as well. Don't forget about that. Okay, so there's also a couple of best practice things that you should be doing just driving your car all the time. And for me, that is little things like running the air conditioning for 5 minutes every single week, even if it's freezing cold outside. By running the air conditioning for at least 5 minutes, you've got that refrigerant circulating throughout the pump, throughout the lines, the condenser, the receiver drive, and that refrigerant has an oil or lubricant inside it. And it just means that when you do need to use the air conditioning, maybe 8 months later properly, everything is already circulated and it's all in operating condition. The same goes for low range and your 4-wheel drive transfer case if you have it. So only do this if you don't have a center diff lock, otherwise you may cause gearbox wind up. And if you do have a center diff lock, make sure it's unlocked. If you have no control over it, then definitely don't do this on hard surfaces. But I used to do it on my Land Cruisers, and I know that some high aces have low range gearing as well. The thing to do is maybe about 2 kilometers before you get home, at least once a month, just switch it into low range, making sure that the center diff is unlocked if you have the option, and then just drive it in low range all the way home for at least 2 or 3 kilometers. And doing that once a month, make sure that all of those gears, the couplings, the linkages, everything gets used, so that when you do go to use it next, it's all in operating condition. Part of the yearly service, regular maintenance, you obviously check the lights, the horn, the windscreen washer, things like that, but you should always be greasing your U-joints. Making sure that they're completely greased at least once a year will save you a lot of headaches down the road. Checking the suspension bushes, getting underneath the car, making sure that everything's nice and tight and as it should be. But one of the things to mention on older cars like this is the jack that comes with the car. If it's a hydraulic type jack, like this one has, chances are it's going to be original and very old. And even if the hydraulic fluid is okay, those seals might not be. And they might not show any leaks while it's sitting in the car. But come time to use it, and you actually put some load on it by lifting your car up, 2 tons of it, it could burst those seals. And if you do have a look at your jack every year as part of the service, maybe you use it to lift one side of the car up for a little while, and do it safely. Don't get under the car while it's lifted by the jack, but just see, you know, within an hour if it drops down on its own or not. If it is starting to leak, then just go out and buy a replacement jack, because while you can probably rebuild it with some new seals, it's not worth risking your life for. And you can always keep it to keep the car original, but just invest in a new one if your bottle jack or hydraulic jack with your car is starting to show its age. Okay, I mentioned repairs separately before. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit excessive to go out and start replacing alternators and starter motors before it's due. So for things like that, for radiators, alternators, brakes, I don't periodically go around replacing them. I just wait until the car needs it, and then I replace them accordingly. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.